Hello and welcome to Surge's December webinar, Living with the Present Uncertainty. My name is Mark Davis. I'm a program leader with the renewal team at Surge. If you are new to Surge, we are a cross-denominational mission sending agency. We are committed to keeping the gospel of grace central to all that we do. We know that we never outgrow our need for grace and believe that the power of God for mission is uniquely expressed in the lives of weak people who know they need Jesus. For us, these webinars are one way that we as a mission seek to nurture a culture of grace in Christian communities around the world. After the presentation today, there will be time for questions, and at any point in the hour, you can submit your questions using the Q&A function in your Zoom toolbar. And during the last 20 minutes, we'll take as many of those as we can. You may also notice the chat and raise hand functions on your screen. We will not be using those functions today, just the Q&A. And it might put some of your minds to rest to know that while you can see the speaker on your screen, neither we at Surge nor other attendees can see you. At this time, let me introduce you to our speaker for the day, Lindsay Kimball. Over the last 10 years, Lindsay has served in a variety of capacities within Surge in the US and abroad. Earlier this year, she was appointed as our new Director of Member Care. And in that capacity, oversees support of many kinds for almost 300 workers around the world. Her great heart is to help our missionaries in the field thrive and flourish over the long haul. Lindsay holds an MA in Biblical Counseling, is a licensed professional counselor, and somehow manages to maintain a small caseload of clients in her spare time. She's joining us live from West Philadelphia today. Lindsay, welcome back.
Thanks, Mark. It's good to be with all of you today. And I want to start by saying that with this topic, I am learning and navigating this right along with you. I think between when the time that Mark asked me to talk about this topic a couple of months ago and today, I've had a lot of hard days in this pandemic. It's a dynamic situation. And I think at various times throughout the last 8 months, we have had a lot of emotions and really walked the spectrum of emotion in dealing with what we face today. And so I come to you this morning as someone who is struggling to navigate this season right alongside you. And that is how I feel as I work with counseling clients and as I walk with our missionaries on the field. We're in this unique season of a shared collective experience of struggle and crisis. So right now, I think we're sitting at a really unique point in this pandemic. The pandemic is not new to us anymore. A lot of you are living in places around the world where you're facing new lockdown measures and spikes in the virus as winter comes. But this time we're not entering into new lockdowns with fresh eyes. We are entering in after 8 long months of struggle. And so in some ways, I think the spot we find ourselves in now, we're entering in with a sense of a lot of weariness from the last 8 months. We're also facing winter, which we've never faced winter before in this pandemic. Limited daylight hours. We're facing navigating the holidays in light of social distancing and just all of the family dynamics that go along with those decisions. And then really a lot of the focus of this webinar is we're still living in this place of uncertainty of when is this going to end? And at Surge, we're in a unique space of really being in a shared struggle with our workers all across the world. It is really interesting to see that some of the struggles they're facing, we're experiencing ourselves in the US. And so, missionaries all over the world are still engaging in kingdom work, but they're doing so in the face of lockdowns and isolation and a lot of the things you're experiencing if you live in the US. So I just want to name a tension, I think, that we're facing here first, and that is that we have this shared grief, and I want to normalize that that we're all experiencing this worldwide trauma and crisis fatigue at the same time, and yet what we're experiencing is not normal. I think when we've been in this season for 8 months, it's easy to feel like this is the new normal. And in some ways it is, but we were not designed and wired to live in light of what COVID has done in our world. We were wired for community, we were wired for interaction. And what we're experiencing is incredibly unique and not a normal season. It's a wilderness season. And I think naming that and having that wilderness mentality can be really helpful, and it can connect us to the people of God in the past, in the history of the world. So I want to start by looking at what we've lost in this time of COVID-19. And, this is a season of loss and grief. And part of grieving well is naming what we've lost. And so I just want you to take a minute this morning to grab a pen and paper, or maybe take out your phone and write some things that you feel like you have lost in the pandemic. What has COVID-19 cost you? What have your neighbors and people in your community lost? So I'm just going to give you a minute or two to jot some of those things down. Okay, so as we think about losses, I think it's important to say that there's tangible losses that we've all endured, and there's also abstract ones. And this is just a quick brainstorm I did of some of the losses that might be represented in the audience we have here today, of things you may have lost. So tangible losses, I won't read all of these, but examples of that would be loss of job or income, grieving the death of family or friends from COVID, the loss of a vacation, the loss of being able to grieve in community when you lose a loved one or be with a loved one as they're sick and die, the loss of in-person gathering for worship, of being able to worship in our communities in person. There's increases in domestic and child abuse during this time when we face increased time at home. But there's abstract losses too, right? That are sometimes harder to name, but they're very real and need to be named. So the loss of the ability to plan for the future, right? I feel majorly the loss of being able to plan things to look forward to. And I realized how much that helps me to have those things on my calendar. Loss of normal rhythms of vacation and holidays, isolation and loneliness, the loss of being able to gather with people. I've talked to some people who say they feel kind of frozen in their pre-pandemic state of whatever changes they were hoping to see, whether it was a career move or physically moving or things like that, starting a new program at school, the loss of being able to start those new things. I think the toll that COVID-19 has taken on social relationships and family relationships as we navigate how to live safely in the midst of this virus, I know it has caused a lot of conflict and a lot of just hard social layers that really have a weight. I think a constant state of being on high alert and realizing that you could be a danger to others. That's something we don't normally walk around feeling the weight of, but we do during this pandemic. So those are just a few of the losses I thought of, and I'm sure you have even more. But when we think about losses, I think we tend to want to avoid sadness. That's our kind of normal response to sadness, to numb it, to distract ourselves. But I think Jesus actually invites us to lean into it and to actively grieve and lament. Zach Eswine wrote a book called Spurgeon's Sorrows, and it's about Charles Spurgeon's struggle with depression throughout his life. But he says it is an act of faith and wisdom to be sad about sad things. So to call out the brokenness and sorrow and grief in our world and name it is actually an act of worship. And you don't need to look further than the Psalms to see that. So learning to recover the art of lament as a form of worship, and realizing that grief actually connects us to Jesus. Lament is a pathway to connecting with God, and it's actually a pathway to connecting with others in this unique season of shared grief and suffering. I think noticing our longings too helps us to understand the way that God wired us. And COVID-19 has given me an opportunity, for instance, to see just how much we're wired to be with other people. We're wired for community. And so taking note of that, of what you can learn about your longings and how God made you. Embodied worship. I had never really thought a ton about how much my soul needs to be with people worshiping in person until I lost that. And the last thing I would say about grieving our losses is we need to acknowledge the trauma of this season. And when I say trauma, I mean that we have been through the ringer together, and there's not an end in sight right now. And so I would invite you to practice the gentleness of Jesus with yourself and with each other. And so what are ways that you can incarnate the compassion of Jesus Christ to those around you and also to yourself? And what that looks like is really understanding that we're in the midst of crisis fatigue, and we need to give ourselves extra margin. We need to take seriously those rhythms of rest and Sabbath. And this is going to take creativity, right? Because we can't go and take a tropical vacation right now. But what are ways that we can provide rhythms of rest for ourselves in this season? And it's a time too to really get professional help if you need it. There are tons of spikes in anxiety and depression right now, and that makes sense. And so knowing when to reach out to a counselor if you need that. So I want to get now to the thing that we're dealing with that is so unique about this season, that is layered on top of all of the loss, and that is living in this uncertainty. And as I thought about this in preparation for the webinar, I kind of thought about how there's two aspects to this that are hard. One part of that is what we just talked about, the fact that the suffering that we're in is prolonged. We are asking, like the psalmist in Psalm 13, how long, O Lord? We don't know how long we're going to continue to endure the losses, the isolation, the fear, the suffering of COVID-19. We're still in it, and we don't know how long it's going to last. But the second reason I think that our present uncertainty is really a struggle for us is that our brains are actually wired to anticipate, to predict, to plan for the future. That is something unique about humans that we do that. A tiny example of that is I took a hike on Sunday. That's being outside is one of my self-care practices in the season. And as I took a hike, where were my eyes? They weren't on the foot I had just planted on the ground. My eyes were on the next piece of land that I was about to step onto, because my brain is anticipating what is my next move, compensating for the obstacles ahead of me. And that tends to be how our brains operate. Kurt Thompson is he's a Christian counselor and psychiatrist who studies interpersonal neurobiology. And he gives this example of if you were in a car accident, and you can just move the one slide back. Thanks. If you were in a car accident and you really badly injured both of your legs, you could hear three different things from the doctor. One would be, the next few months are going to be hard, but you will regain use of your legs and you're going to make a full recovery. Yeah, that's hard in the immediate term, but there's hope. you can navigate that. The second thing they might say is, this injury is devastating and you need to know and prepare for the fact that you will likely never walk again. So devastating news, right? But the third thing the doctor might say is, we don't know. It could be you could regain use of your legs in the next few months and are able to run marathons again, but it actually may be that you'll never be able to walk again. And I think this response is devastating, but also just totally disorienting. And it robs the person of the ability to anticipate and plan for the future. And that's just a little bit of a taste of why uncertainty can be hard for us. But we also, I think, prior to COVID-19, we fell into this illusion of certainty, right? Like, is our present uncertainty any more uncertain than what we were already living in? And so I just want to look a little bit at this and ask, how did we previously live with a fair amount of feeling control over our plans for the future, but how much of that was actually an illusion? And I think certainty is something that, even our illusion of certainty is something that functions in a certain way for us. It allows us to be soothed. It brings comfort. And frankly, it frees us from feeling like we are dependent on God. And there's a quote from Kurt Thompson on the next slide there, who is the person I just mentioned. And this quote really struck me as I read it, and I'm just going to read it for you now. "This uncertain future, this madness of time, does not suit my penchant for predicting and regulating all the variables in the world that make me anxious. I believe that the way to contain my anxiety that has led to my exhaustion, that has led to my irritability, that is wrapped in my grief for all that COVID-19 has robbed me of, is to reestablish my capacity to predict my future, to once again be master of my universe, to be like I was before coronavirus. As much as anything that COVID-19 has dismantled, my hubristic confidence that I can control my future by fixing any problem that comes my way on my timetable may be one of the most prominent, if only temporarily." And so I'd invite you to consider this morning that, yes, we are living in a time of incredible uncertainty right now. And it may also be that that has always been the case. That any element of certainty we felt like we had over the future is somewhat of an illusion that functions in a certain way for us. And that's not to minimize how overwhelming our uncertainty is today, but to just give some perspective to it. But I want to give us some good news here in our present uncertainty. And this might be the first time certainly my generation, has ever experienced a crisis of this proportion on such a global scale. It's the first time I have faced such a prolonged season of uncertainty. And certainly this may be a new thing for us in 2020. But seasons of prolonged suffering nor seasons of incredible uncertainty are unknown to the people of God throughout history. We are not the first generation of God's people to walk through seasons like this. In fact, God's people have a long history of walking through wilderness. And this is a wilderness season for us, like the Israelites wandering in the desert for 40 years, not knowing if they'd reach the promised land tomorrow or not until after they die, right? And I think of God asking them to live on the manna he gives them just for that day, and how they, like us, their hearts wanted to collect and store and save and prepare for the next day with the manna. And that just reminds me of the state of my heart in the midst of this. But I think even more precious is the truth that God is in the business of leading his people through seasons of wilderness, suffering, and uncertainty. And what's even more is this is how he works in the world. He writes his story of redemption in our world through the journeys of his people, through wilderness seasons. That is what he does. And so that has not stopped. That continues, that God is writing an unfolding story that includes COVID-19. So as we think about how we can combat anxiety about future uncertainty, the thing I would challenge us with is to fight for presence in the present. So asking that question of what can I do today to help me stay connected with what's happening in my heart and mind, to connect with others, and to experience real connection with God. And, you know, in the secular world, there's a lot of talk about the benefit of mindfulness, and I support that. And I think that the reason that mindfulness is such a helpful practice is because God wired our brains to live in the present, and to be in tune and connected to ourselves and to others and to Him. So 3 ways to think about staying connected. One is staying connected to your present self, your mind, your heart, your body. And we did part of that earlier today in naming our losses. But taking time each day to really name where your heart is, to name, you know, what are the emotions that are rising to the surface right now for me. In a time when so much, for me, so much of my work exists through a screen right now. And I know for a lot of you too. And so it's extra important to try to be in our body and connected to our bodies. And one way to do that is to think about experiences that engage your 5 senses, you know, and focusing on that, noticing what you gather through the senses, focusing on one task at a time and being mindful of what that task is. So, for instance, when you're washing the dishes, focusing on how does the water feel on my hands, right? And resisting the temptation to watch a podcast while you're doing that, and a million other things. Limiting screen time and social media. That screen time and social media tend to take us out of the present and disconnect us with what we're experiencing in the moment. Even though they're great tools to stay connected, I think just being mindful of how much time we're spending there. Combating virtual experiences with embodied ones. So, you know, between Zoom calls, can you get out and take a walk? Things like that. And practicing gratitude. So along with naming your losses, naming the ways that you see God providing. You know, connecting to each other. I think we're in a really opportune time to realize we have a shared collective grief that actually can connect us in deep ways to community. From where I sit at Surge, I get to hear stories from all over the world of our workers having amazing connections with their neighbors as they share the suffering season together. I think COVID has opened doors in some ways for us to be present with the people who live on our block, who we're physically planted with in a certain space and time, and allowing the shared grief to open doorways for conversation and compassion. I think finding ways to stay emotionally and socially engaged, even while we're physically distancing from others. And I know there's a lot of creative ways to do that. But I'd also challenge you to look for ways to love those around you. You know, it's a great way to stay present. Mission keeps us present. And so where can you enter in and walk with your neighbors through what we're facing? And I would say one thing here is to resist the urge to compare. And I can do this a lot of invalidating my own experience with COVID because it's not as bad as what someone else experienced. That's not really ever helpful. And so just resisting the urge to compare, even as we experience this crisis together. And then finally, how can staying in the present and the challenges we're facing in the present be pathways to intimacy with Jesus? You know, the certainty of his presence is sure and certain. He lives to comfort his children. He lives to walk with us in the adversities we face. That might be the truest thing I say to you today, is that he is active and awake on his throne, and he lives to walk with us through this. So how can, as you stay connected to your emotions and to people around you, how can noticing those things, those griefs and losses you feel, actually connect you to Jesus? And there's a tool that we have used at times at Surge. It's in our book On Mission by Patrick Kanak. It's called the 5-minute drill. And this is just a really basic, practical thing you can use as you go about your days. The first part of this is just to notice, notice when you're feeling overwhelmed or anxious, frustrated, scared, to just take note of that and to pause and to let that experience of that emotion be an invitation to connect you to Jesus. And then to spend a couple of minutes asking the Holy Spirit to reveal what might be going on in your heart. Maybe there's something you're struggling to believe, even struggling to believe that you can openly express your grief and sorrow and lament to God. Is there something about the gospel or about Jesus that we're not trusting, receiving, relying on? And then to spend a couple of minutes asking the Spirit to remind us of what's true, to really reorient our hearts to God's sure and certain promises, and to experience his presence through reading scripture or spending time in silence or listening to a worship song, and then re-engaging the situation with a renewed awareness of God's presence with and partnership with you. I want to look at a passage in Matthew right now. And this is a passage from when Jesus is in the garden, the night he was to be betrayed. And it says, Jesus went with them to a place called Gethsemane. And he said to his disciples, sit here while I go over there and pray. And taking with him Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee, he began to be sorrowful and troubled. And then he said to them, my soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch with me. And going a little further, he fell on his face and prayed, saying, Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. And he came to the disciples and found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, so you could not watch with me 1 hour. And when I see this passage, I'm comforted to know that Jesus, who was without sin and had perfect connection with the Father, and knew what he was about to face, he needed presence. He needed friends to keep watch with him. And he was denied that in the end, right? But I think this is a picture of Jesus's humanity, of needing connection and relationship. And so that passage is always a comfort to me when I, feel that need for connection to others. So I want to, because it's December at the time of this recording, I want to invite us to look a little bit at the Advent season. This is a season the church calendar is entering into that is a season of longing, right? But it's a longing that is filled with direction and certain promise. We are people who long for certainty. And can we let that be a fragrance? It's a fragrance of the way we were created, right? We were created to long for shalom, for all things being made new. We were created to long for perfect belonging, for being known and cared for by God. And so the longing we're feeling in COVID-19 for healing, for community, for an end to the crisis, it's really an echo of what we were made for. And so if you feel longing, that's why we were wired to long for all things to be made new. And we've actually been waiting far longer for that than the last 8 months. God's people are a people who watch and wait. That is part of our vocation. But the good news is we're actually waiting for something that we are certain of. And I don't mean certain of how COVID-19 is going to pan out, but I mean that we have a present certainty and we have a future certainty. And so I want to just invite you to let a few scripture passages wash over you. When we think about our present certainty, I want to read to you from John 6. John 6 says, I am the bread of life. Your ancestors ate the manna in the wilderness, yet they died. But here is the bread that comes down from heaven, which anyone may eat and not die. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Whoever eats this bread will live forever. This bread is my flesh, which I will give for the life of the world." So as the Israelites scrambled to collect manna for tomorrow in the wilderness, we actually are invited to feast on Jesus as our manna for today, and that is certain. He invites us to feast on himself. And even that idea of that embodied act of communion week by week, when Jesus invited his disciples to celebrate the meal, the bread and the wine, every time they gathered, it's a sensory, physical reminder that we are invited to feast on Jesus in the midst of our uncertainty. But then we have more than that. We have a future uncertainty too. And I'm going to read a little bit from Revelation 21 here. "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away.' And he who was seated on the throne said, 'I am making everything new.' And then he said, 'Write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true.'" That is our future certainty, what we see in Revelation. And I'd encourage you to camp out there in the next few weeks. But there's one more thing I want to talk about, and that is an invitation. We actually have an invitation to be part of ushering in this vision that's in Revelation 21. We are part of a kingdom story, and we are wired for participation in that future hope that we see in Revelation. And so, one of the best things for me about my work at Surge right now is it forces me to look up. And without that, it would be so easy, and it still is very easy for me to get lost in my current sufferings and struggles. But I'd invite you to look up, see the kingdom at hand, look for the ways that God is inviting you into mission, even now, maybe especially now. We are invited into a deep and rich history of God leading his people through the wilderness and working through them in the midst of that. In Psalm 13, it starts out by the psalmist saying, "How long, O Lord?" And it ends with him returning to that truth of God's unfailing love. And so there's an invitation to experience and be a conduit of the unfailing love of Jesus in the present. God does not require us to know the way ahead in order to accomplish his purposes through us. And that is a sure and certain hope. So that's what I leave you with today. And I'd invite you to join in the practice of Advent longing in this season, knowing that we actually long for something that is certain and true. So I'm going to turn it over to Mark with the Q&A time now.
Lindsay, thank you so much. There's just lots to think about, and we want to continue to reflect together really in kind of a conversation now. It's still possible to submit questions for Lindsay using that Q&A function in your Zoom menu bar. We have a few that we can start with. So Lindsay, the things that you've just been talking about in regard to looking up, it seems like it would be helpful maybe to unpack that a little bit more. When I am in a negative frame of mind, it can be difficult to break out of that. And how do I train myself to see things around me that are hopeful and encouraging?
That's a good question. I think the first thing is to fight to look for those things. I think gratitude is a great way to start that. I know a lot of people who have found the practice of naming 5 things they're grateful for at the end of the day being a really huge part of being able to kind of look up. But I would also staying connected with others and hearing stories of how God is providing for his people is really helpful. Being, fighting to kind of look up and be others focused as well, to look for the needs around you. That can be hugely helpful in a time where it feels like our own sorrows are overwhelming.
I think along those lines, this might be a good one to go to in being aware of people around us. I think a number of the folks who are tuned in are people who are involved in caring for others in different ways and just want to be better attuned to that. So we have a question just asking what issues you're seeing in folks that are particularly common that people can be alert to be able to love others well.
Yeah, that's a good question. I see. Well, first of all, I would say for people who are in caring professions or areas of ministry, one challenge of this pandemic is that the struggles that you're seeking to help people walk through are some of the very same struggles you're currently facing. And so we are a people in crisis trying to love people in crisis, and that's hard. And I think just saying that, and for those of you who care for others, self-care is going to be extra important. But some of the common issues I've seen come up again and again is, for people who live alone, the isolation of COVID-19 is really hard, especially as we enter into winter months. So, considering how you can look for the lonely people in your midst and creatively be community to them, whether that means gathering outside or maybe inviting them into your COVID bubble. But I would also say for people in marriages and families, just the toll being at home all together has taken on relationships. I've seen marriages struggling, just increased frustration and discord in parenting with kids. Those are some things. I think a lot of fear, of what will COVID-19 cost us ultimately, what's going to happen to my child if they don't get to socialize with other kids. I mean, fears like that too. But also, I think we're getting to a point where a lot of people have lost loved ones in this season. It's 8 months. And so just the grieving process being hard, even if you didn't lose the person to COVID-19, but being robbed of that ability to mourn in community, I think has been really challenging for people. A lot of spikes in anxiety and depression. If something was hard before COVID, if a marriage was struggling before COVID-19, it's probably really struggling now. So keeping in mind those things, I think, is important.
Yeah, those are helpful. Lindsay, you spoke some about resisting the urge to compare.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of folks just find that easier said than done, I guess. And it's just such a native instinct that we go to so quickly. So we have a question asking whether you have any tips on fighting the urge to compare.
I think the biggest tip is to notice when you're doing it. You're right, Mark. It is just it's a bend of our fallen hearts is to compare. We want some kind of measuring stick, something to either justify our own struggle or mitigate it, and it doesn't help. But it is what our hearts do, and so just noticing it when it's happening and allowing Jesus to invite you to talk about your griefs, right? And to pray for others who are experiencing other struggles, but not needing to compare the two, I think. I would also say, as you walk with other people, it's important to stay curious because the way all of us are experiencing this pandemic, there's some similarities, but there's also some differences. And so fighting to stay curious about, what are the particular things for this friend that I'm talking with that are hard for them, and not assuming that, because what's hard for you. And that's a balance to strike, right? Because there is that shared collective grief and similarity, but there's also differences. So yeah. And I would put a plug in for our discipleship lab with this. You can read more about it on Sergio's website, but it's a great course that helps you really build a toolbox for listening and coming alongside people.
Yeah, great. Okay, I think maybe to kind of combine a couple questions here. I think a lot of us hear things like you want to look for creative ways to connect with others and stuff like that. And we say, yes, that's what I want to do. But then the creativity tank is kind of low. So we have a question asking for, creative ways to maintain social connection in this time other than Zoom.
I know, that's the hard thing. I feel like we all had a lot of creative ways at the beginning, but we're all so zoomed out. When someone suggests a Zoom game night to me, I just feel like I don't want any part of that. I spend all day on the screen. I would say the outdoors is probably your best friend for this. And, we're in Philadelphia, so the time is coming where it's going to be really cold outside, but figuring out, can I bundle up and take walks with people? We actually just heard from one of our overseas workers that her church raised money to send money to her to buy a fire pit so they could gather outside, so things like that. I think also this sounds very simple, but the art of the phone call, I think, is somewhat of a lost art. There are a lot of reasons, and Kurt Thompson actually writes about this on his blog. There's a lot of reasons why Zoom is so draining. And the phone is actually a great option when you do want to connect with people far away. There's ways that is a lot easier on us mentally to engage over the phone. And so I would say, go old school.
Yeah. Sometimes it's nice not to be seen by other people. As you talk about the winter weather, I have a friend who says, there is no bad weather, only inappropriate clothing.
That's great. That's great. Yeah, I have friends who are investing in extra warm winter gear right now because they know they're going to need to be outside in order to see people. And so that sounds worth it to me. Do you have any other creative ideas, Mark?
Yeah, long underwear for Christmas. Yeah, no, we've done outside too, and for sure fire pits are a big deal. We've been trying to think if there's a way that we could position a fire pit in our property that would work without burning anything down.
And I would say another piece of this is when I am in a place of despair, it's not a natural thing for me to reach out to others. And I think during COVID-19, it's easy to believe the lie of, well, everyone else is struggling too, and so I can't reach out. Everyone else is in a hard place too. But the fact is God created us to be in community. That is pre-fall, right? That we need each other. And so even noticing that resistance in yourself and fighting to reach out and text a friend or call a friend when you're struggling is good. And actually it's life-giving for that friend to lift up their eyes and to connect with you.
Yeah, that's helpful. We hesitate, to tell our troubles to other people. Some of us have been trained not to do that, not to burden other people, but to think of that actually as potentially helpful for somebody else too, to be lifted out of their small bubble into a bigger world. Yeah. Let me combine a couple here again. And I think both of these potentially take us back to the 5-minute drill. So one question, what do you do when you find yourself getting angry about little things? And another question that's more in the direction of grief and yeah, mourning, grieving for a loved one who's not with us anymore. So maybe if you could help us with that drill again and think about how that might intersect with those kinds of questions.
Yeah, I think the 5-minute drill is especially helpful for anger, because when there's anger going on or irritability, there's usually something deeper behind it. I say to my counseling clients a lot that behind anger is usually a lot of tenderness. And so, first of all, I would say increased irritability is normal right now. That is to be expected. We are all living in crisis fatigue mode, and so you are going to be more irritable. And so, when you notice that anger emotion coming up, taking that 1 minute of the drill to ask yourself, what's going on underneath that? What am I fearful about, or what am I sad about? Asking those questions can often help you get to the core. And when you get to that core of fear or sadness, it actually allows us to have and receive the compassion from Jesus in the midst of that, where when we only identify the anger, we can often feel shame, which disconnects us. But to realize that there's something deeper and more tender going on there, and inviting Jesus into that. And so that's what I would say about anger. And what was the second question, Mark?
Well, if you could talk more about grief. I think the thing about grief is that it does sort of wash over you. You can feel sort of okay for a little while, and then it just hits you blindsided. And to engage those moments when sadness kind of washes.
Yeah. I mean, what you just said is great, to realize that it's not a linear thing. And there's days where you might feel fine, and there's days that feel impossible to get through, right? And so on those days especially, that's when you want to keep in mind those 3 ways of connecting. How can I connect to another person today? How can I connect to God today in my grief? How can I connect to my own emotions? And my favorite picture of Jesus when it comes to grief is that picture of him weeping over Lazarus's tomb. That picture of a God who knows the end of the story, right? He knows he's going to raise Lazarus really soon, actually. But he weeps. And we actually have a weeping Savior who is a companion in our suffering. And so I think keeping that picture of Jesus in mind, our older brother who has suffered, who weeps with us, can be really important. I think it's also even inviting yourself to grieve that you haven't been able to have a normal grieving process, and naming that. There's a reason that our society has certain mourning and grieving rituals. We need those in a way. They're really helpful for us to have closure. And when we're robbed of that, it is really hard. And so even being able to grieve that is good.
And maybe flowing from that, you talked a little bit about lament. And this is something that I feel like I never heard about praying laments until about a year ago. And for many of us, this is still a new idea. And for some of us, it's a brand new idea. What does it look like to pray the prayers of the Psalms of Lament? How do we do that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I discovered praying the Psalms of Lament because there have been times in my life where those were the only pieces of scripture my heart could hear. And so starting in those Psalms and just reading through them and finding your own emotions voiced in the voice of David or, the psalmists, and realizing that God included, he included those voices in scripture for a reason, right? One practice that I have assigned to counseling clients over the years has been to write your own Psalm of Lament. And so to look at some of those Psalms of Lament and then write your own. I think we tend to feel for some reason like we need to come to God with a cleaned up list of requests, right? And not our raw emotion, but what does it look like to actually bring ourselves unfiltered to him and fight to believe that, like a father with his child, he really wants to hear it all. And, I think of Jacob wrestling with God, right? And in the wrestling, there's real intimacy. You can't wrestle with someone unless you're close to them. So, and I would say Psalm 88 is one of my favorite Psalms because it doesn't end on a high note. It doesn't end on, but God provided. It ends on the last verses, darkness is my closest friend. And there have been days that I have felt that. And there's probably been days that many of you have felt that. And so being able to see your own kind of deepest thoughts voiced in God's word is really powerful.
Yeah, there's that verse, right, about we don't know what to pray, but the Spirit intercedes for us. And I think one way that happens is kind of putting that together with the idea of the Psalms as the prayer book for the people of God. Like I don't know what to say to God. God gives us in the Psalms, here are some words to say to God, right? And the whole idea that among the words that are appropriate to say to God could be darkness is my closest friend, it's sort of a permission, isn't it, to read things to God in a way that becomes personal and my own. Good.
And as we talk about those emotions, I would say it is a comfort that the truest thing about you and me is not what we're feeling or our emotions. Those things are valid and good to stay attuned to. But the truest thing about us is that we belong to Jesus, right? And that is sure and certain. And that's the context in which we voice our emotions to God as beloved children who are delighted in. And so to fight to believe that is really the truest thing about us is really important.
Let's go in a little bit of a different direction here, but I think this is one that a lot of folks can relate to. 2020 has left me feeling out of step with people I used to consider close friends. How do I pursue community when my relationships have been so strained?
COVID has put a whole really tricky layer, I think, on relationships, both family relationships and friends. And we're all living in this place of fear and trying to figure out how to navigate what we're facing. And I think the best thing to do about that, I think, is to name it with the people we love, and to voice it, and to not pretend it doesn't exist, but to actually have the conversations with friends of, what do you feel comfortable with in terms of getting together? And just putting those things on the table rather than being the elephant in the room. And to do that, we're going to have to be sure of our security in Christ, right? Like to lay our own righteousness aside. It's a great opportunity to really have to live off of the fact that our reputation is held safe and secure by Christ, because there's a lot of room to get defensive or to, feel shame or whatnot. So it's a good opportunity to really practice living out of your security in Jesus that enables you to actually love each other by asking what the other needs, right? And inviting people to share. So I don't know if that gets at the question, but yeah, I would say, and I struggle with it too. It's in a worldwide crisis, it feels like the last thing we need to have a complicated layer added to relationships, but that is what we're facing, unfortunately. So just naming that as one of the complexities and struggles. I mean, that's a grief too, right? That's one of the things I grieve. So yeah.
Yeah, that takes some courage to express that to the other person. But, yeah. Last one. Making decisions is really hard right now. Find myself getting paralyzed. Any help for making decisions now without paralysis?
I wish I knew. These questions are so good because they're all things that, all questions I've had and wanted to phone a friend for many times over the last months. Help for making decisions.
We should give you the phone a friend option.
No. What if I called you, Mark?
Ask the audience.
I feel like a little bit of a broken record here of saying stay connected to others and to God, but leaning into other voices and leaning into Jesus in the toughness of making decisions. We are all fatigued in a lot of ways. And so decision making is harder right now. And we have more decisions than ever that are facing us, right? And so especially now with the holidays coming, we are in a really hard territory with what to do about holidays and all of that. And so acknowledging the hardness of that, having a few people you trust to kind of talk things through with, realizing that it's okay if you need some help making decisions, and having that be something that you feel freedom to talk to Jesus about too. And I think with decision making, like a lot of the paralyzed feeling can come from, what if I make the wrong decision, right? And so even as you notice that fear, recognizing, what does it mean that I actually have the perfect record of Christ credited to me, and I am a beloved child, and he actually right now is on his throne, caring for and providing for me, and of course he is going to help me in this decision. And so even using the struggle with the decision-making process to be a pathway to dependence on Jesus can be really good.
Well, Lindsay, thank you so much. It's been a really helpful hour. It's been helpful for me. I think it's been helpful for a lot of folks. So we so appreciate your time and the effort that you've put into engaging these things for yourself so that you can be helpful to others.
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Mark.
Before we go, let me give you a preview for coming attractions after the new year. Our next webinar will be on January the 13th, and the subject for that one is God disappointed with me? And I will be the speaker for that one. I also want to just take a moment to highlight a couple of resources that might be particularly helpful. Promises in the Dark by Dr. Eric McLaughlin, who's a missionary physician with us in Burundi, is just a very kind of honest and personal engagement with the challenges of engaging with long-term difficulty in a way that is not amenable to quick and easy answers. And also, Lindsay brought us some words from the book of Revelation, So I want just to point you back again to Scotty Smith's very helpful gospel-centered life in the Bible study. The book of Revelation seems to be a place that is just uniquely helpful for God's people at this time, and a good place for us to camp out this Advent. In the following week, you'll be receiving a follow-up email. A number of folks asked if they could have a copy of the slides and whether there'd be a recording available. In that email, we'll send you a link to the webinar, and we can also arrange to send the slides. Finally, if you'd like to review Surge's webinar archive or explore other renewal resources, or investigate overseas missionary opportunities, all of that is available at www.surge.org. From all of us at Surge, we wish you a very blessed and Merry Christmas. Thank you for joining us today.